Assalamualaikum and hi to Dr. Zalani and friends. Today, me and my group members will be presenting on the textual analysis of the poem that we have chosen. We chose the poem Kambing Hitam by Usman Awang as the issue addressed in the poem caught our curiosity since it was related to one of the most significant events in Malaysia, known as the tragedy of May 13. Although the tragedy has occurred decades ago, it is still fresh in Malaysian society. The tragic event of May 13 happened in Malaysia on May 13, 1969, and it was one of Malaysia's darkest histories as the tragedy involved racial tensions and violence that resulted in a number of deaths. The well-known national author Usman Awang wrote this poem as soon as the incident occurred. It features criticism of the political scheming that led to the murders of the scapegoats carried out in the name of racial prejudice, communism, fanaticism, and gangsterism. According to a website named Aliran, the poem emphasized 5 main points including preserving human dignity and quality of life, promoting equitable, sustainable development, addressing the environmental crisis, celebrating cohesion and inclusion, preserving democracy and upholding the rule of law, and fighting cronyism and corruption. According to Cambridge Dictionary, translation is the process of translating something from one language to another. The poem of Kambing Hitam was then translated into English under the title The Scapegoat and published in the collection of poetry by Malaysian poets known as Suara Tujuh. The publication of the English version can assist people who don't speak the original language understand and relate to the concepts, imagery, and emotions the poem expresses. It also broadens the poem's audience and promotes the intercultural dialogue of our culture with non-Malaysians.
So now let us move on to the next part, which is textual analysis. So for our chosen text, numerous translation techniques were employed to render the poem in its translated form and maintain its meaning. The procedure of translation plays a crucial role during the adjustment phase of message transmission from the source language to the target language. The translation procedures employed in the target language include direct translation procedures and oblique translation procedures. The first procedure, which is a direct translation procedure, includes 3 techniques, which are borrowing, calque, and literal translation. The translator used direct translation procedure to ensure the intended meaning is conveyed. For example, literal translation technique were found in the poem where the sentences nilai pasaran Jalan Raya Muda were translated to the market value in Jalan Raya Muda. Following that, calque technique are employed to translate Ibu Kota to capital city. The last technique for the direct translation procedure, which is borrowing, is used where cupak beras is translated to cupak of rice. The next procedure is the oblique translation procedure. There are only 2 techniques, and which are modulation and adaptation, are used in this translation. The first one is modulation. Modulation is seen as switching the phrase's point of view or perspective. An example of modulation found in the text is where ada komentar dalam hati is translated to the word unspoken. Lastly, the second technique of oblique translation procedure found in the poem is adaptation. For example, sorak surai is translated to the applause of the jury.
Now, let's move on to the review and conclusion. Based on the analysis of the poem Kambing Hitam by Usman bin Awang, the writer employs several techniques such as literal translation, modulation, adaptation, equivalent, and borrowing. The translator appears to have used a significant amount of direct literal translation. According to the analysis explanation of basic techniques, the translator appears to have used some effective techniques to convey the intended message to the target audience. the author decided to use these techniques to improve the reader's comprehension of the text, and the techniques are effective because certain words are distinct between the two languages. However, when the writer employs a literal translation of the poem, certain flaws become apparent. This can be seen when the sentence "masing-masing pendakwa raya menghujah tanpa bahas" is translated as "everyone is a public prosecutor arguing without language," and the real intention of the author is misinterpreted by the English readers. The reader will misunderstand as the author attempts to convey that anyone can be a public prosecutor and what they argue without using language or words, but Usman, our intended message is that everyone argue in the street as they are the prosecutor and they are being impolite and disrespectful during those days. The translation of terkutuklah barang siapa mengutukinya is translated as curse is the critique. It's a different case of the author's use of literal translation errors. In this sentence, native English speakers may have difficulty comprehending the author intended meaning because the literal translation is grammatically improper. This phrase could be rendered as condemning those who criticize this piece. According to Awang 2012, literal translation sometimes is strange, lack of naturalness, and difficulty in understanding that can lead to the text becoming unclear or misinterpreted. This technique can also increase reading time and the complexity of comprehending the translation itself. Next, let's move on to the suggestion that the writer can do to improvise the translation. The writer should comprehend the entire context of the material before translating each word at a time in order to improve the translation, especially in literal translation, by having a thorough understanding of the topic of the material, whether it be in their language, culture, or a slightly distinct forms. So the writer should also take cultural differences into account when translating the poem because English and Malay do not share the same cultural background. Based on the analysis, the writer made some adaptations such as changing the phrase to sorak surai to the word applause of the jury to better help readers in understanding the poem. The writer did a very wonderful job of describing the cultural distinctions in terms that English readers could understand the poem. So, in addition, translation is typically alters the phrase, sentence, words, and grammatical structure. The writer can adapt the sentence structure by fully understanding the phrase as a whole, then attempt to translate according to the meaning while avoiding a word-for-word translation, or they can identify the text based on the overall message or idea. So usually, when the writer focuses on the whole message or idea, this translation is not bound to literal translation. Last but not least, one of the most important steps to improve a translation is to seek feedback and review by a professional before making it official or publishing it. As humans, we are prone to making mistakes. It is essential to recheck their translation and allow professionals to provide feedback. In addition to aiding in the identification of hidden errors, multiple and different viewpoints can provide a unique vantage point for interpreting a text. So literal translation errors, also known as interference, are a highly prevalent issue accounted in the field of translation according to Awang 2012. Meaning components lexical elements occurrence of the same meaning in different forms, representation of the same form by different meanings, and representations of different forms by the same meaning all provide challenges to even experienced translators, according to Putri 2019. Therefore, it is nearly impossible to have a decent translation without the feedback of others, as interference from our native tongue is sometimes involved.
This poem touches on some serious issues such as cronyism and corruptions, and addressing environmental crises and persevering democracy. It is very important for the translator to make sure that the translated version will carry the same gravity the poem intended to bring. In order to achieve that, in these translated versions, the writer employed various of techniques in the text such as borrowing, call, adaptation, and modulation. Without this technique, it can be quite hard for them and for the writer to explain to the readers that does not speak the source language to comprehend and understand the intended meaning of the original poem. Based on these techniques used by the writer, we can come to the conclusion that the gravity of the source text is visible as well in the translated version. Other than the literal issue mentioned by my friend just now, the other element shows that the translated English versions of the poem is a good quality of translation. The involvement of different techniques employed in the poem, most of the
most of it did not just use literal translation. For example, the writer could just translate ahli fikir negara into member the nation, but instead they used the national philosopher. Another example is sorak-sorai, which could be borrowing, but instead the writer chose a proper technique, which is adaptation, and sorak-sorai is translated into applause of the jury, which is to ensure that the meaning is understandable. Although it is a usage of a totally different word, this gave the audience or the reader a more realistic understanding of the context of the poem, and it also shows that the translator really did consider the proper technique and for the translation. That's all. Thank you from us.